My name is Musa Malik, and I'm an incoming graduate student at the Department of Communication at UC Santa Barbara. I'm also a research member at the Media Neuroscience Lab, and today I shall be sharing with you some of our findings from an active project in our lab that tries to answer the question, what drives news sharing across the globe? I hope you enjoy this presentation. Over the last decade or so, communication research and related fields have started to examine the underlying mechanisms and consequences of online news sharing. These research efforts are largely motivated by the increasing number of social media users who have begun to share news within their online networks, effectively causing news to become a significant portion of social media content. These efforts for advancing the study of news sharing are pioneering, of course, but they remain limited in many important ways. They primarily study Western countries, and they mostly are focused on individual sharing motivations and news content attributes, whilst neglecting the influence of external geospatial differences in cultural contexts and media systems. Given these limitations, it then becomes a little bit unclear how established theories of news sharing, such as diffusion of innovations or news value theory or news framing, even apply when being extended to diverse populations, cultures, and media contexts. A lot of researchers recently have started to recognize these limitations and have begun research efforts to examine sharing patterns across nations. And this study, this presentation, is, we hope, a small contribution to this emerging line of research. So we specifically want to understand how cross-national structural variations that encompass variables such as press and internet freedom and types of media and political systems and levels of economy and social stability and underlying population characteristics, how these macro variations actually impact online news sharing. And we're also very interested in the article-based content features, such as news values and news topics and news frames, and how they interact with the country's underlying media system and cultural context. So, in order to answer some of these questions that we posed in the beginning of this presentation, we obtained articles from a selection of news sources across various countries and different world regions. Our selection of world regions was informed by the geographical division protocol of the World Bank, and we selected 2 countries from each region. The division by the World Bank actually dividing the world into 6 specific regions. We selected 2 countries from each region, one with a lower income status and one with a higher income status. Thereafter, we attempted to select 3 sources from each country, and we tried to sample sources with diverse political leanings using an online platform called the Media Bias Monitor. After we had selected our news sources, we fed them into an online service called ICA, which is an interface for communication research. ICA retrieves and parses news records indexed by the global database of events, language, and tone, which the short form for which is GDELT. It is a vast and open source and constantly updated repository of online news and event metadata that is collected from tens of thousands of news outlets around the world. Using ICA, we retrieved all news articles for each source that were published between January 1st and December 31st, 2018. But we weren't just interested in news articles themselves, we were also interested in the article content features. And for this, we leveraged GDELT's implementation of the Global Knowledge Graph, which is the GKG. These content features are many, of course, but we specifically looked at and extracted topics and issues that articles were talking about, events that they were referring to, sentiment scores and polarity levels. We extracted Luke variables, Luke standing for Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which is a popular word count-based dictionary for detecting the presence of different word categories in text. And specifically, we were interested in measuring the presence of moral keywords, for which we relied on GKG's implementation of the Moral Foundations Dictionary. The MFD contains, allow me to go off on a little bit of a tangent for the purpose and interest of this presentation. the MFD contains pre-selected word lists that aim to reflect the 5 moral foundations as identified by moral foundations theory. These foundations include care, fairness, sanctity, loyalty, and authority. And each moral foundation in the MFD is further split into virtues and vice. So if there is a moral foundation called care, the vice of that moral foundation would be harm, which is a violation. If there is a moral foundation called loyalty, then the violation of that would be betrayal. And MFD or GKG's implementation of MFD also provides scores for these 2 separate dimensions as well. Furthermore, after we had gotten these URLs, we fed them into sharedcount.com, which is an API for querying how many times a particular news article's URL has been shared on Facebook. And finally, after this, we looked at country-level metadata. So we extracted a specific socio-political metadata for each specific country that we were studying. I'll quickly go over some of the variables that we incorporated within this research project. These included the Gini index, which is an economic indicator to measure income disparity within countries. We extracted press freedom index, internet freedom index. We used a numerical measure developed by Schaller and Murray in 2008, a paper in 2008, that looks at a region's historical pathogen prevalence. Furthermore, we also extracted the World Democracy Index, looked at levels of peacefulness or states of stability across different countries, and we finally also used Hofstede's cultural dimensions that was updated in 2015 to extract individualism versus collectivism scores. All of these meta variables were then or all of these variables actually were then fed into a central database that we used for subsequent analysis in this research project. Because this is an initial phase of our research project, we limited our news articles to about 3,200, only spanning the year of 2018 and limiting ourselves to only 32 sources and 12 countries. This slide very quickly shows you a visual representation of some of the data that we have just talked about in the previous slide. These are essentially socio-political dimensions of each country, and the x-axes below indicate the z-scores for each socio-political dimension for each country. We were really interested in looking at the distributions of distributions of share counts across different countries. And if you look at the chart on the right hand side, the log share count distributions, we find that the distribution of share counts remains largely heterogeneous, with some countries actually having a mean of share counts very close to 0. For example, Jordan and Indonesia, while other mostly English-speaking countries seem to have very high share counts, including, say, Australia, United States, and Canada, which is an interesting observation for us. Moreover, we were interested in looking at the prevalence of moral norms across countries. If you look at the box and plots on this slide, just so that we're on the same page, let's try to understand what's going on over here. So above the threshold of 0, you will find that all the regions of the box plot that are above 0 are representing moral virtues. So remember in the previous slides we talked about the differentiation between moral virtues and moral vices. That's essentially what's happening here. So if you look at the blue plot, the blue box plot, all the values above 0 are actually representing care, whereas all the values that are below 0, they are representing harm. Similarly, for green, the green box plot, all the values above 0 are representing loyalty, whereas all the values below 0 are representing betrayal. And keeping this logic in mind, we interestingly see that the dimensions of harm and loyalty and authority seem to be saliently and cross-culturally represented in a similar fashion, which is, for me, quite an interesting observation by itself. So, keeping these interesting insights, descriptive insights that we just found in mind. In this initial phase of our research project, we want to see and further explore what might be driving these country-level differences and similarities. And so for this purpose, for right now, we just looked at the influence, or focused on the influence, of press freedom and historical pathogen prevalence as our country-level metadata that we wanted to incorporate and analyze further. We expect that news sharing counts will be lower within countries in which citizens are more likely to face legal consequences due to their online sharing behavior. So countries with lower press freedom would actually have lower news sharing counts, whereas countries with higher press freedom will actually have higher news sharing counts. We also we also have some expectations about article content features, in particular the moral content of articles. And we believe that news articles salient in binding moral norms being loyalty, authority, sanctity, these will be shared more frequently in countries with higher historical pathogen prevalence, for which there is evidence in previous literature. And in contrast, we believe that news articles salient in individualizing moral norms, which would represent care and fairness, would be shared more frequently in countries with lower historical pathogen prevalence. In order to test some of these expectations, we developed a series of multi-level models, and interestingly found some of the interesting findings that we found were that at least 37.7% of variance in log transform share counts could just be easily explained if you add a country location as a random variable in the model, which is very, very not so surprising, but also very interesting observation and finding nonetheless. If you add countries' press freedom into the model compared to the null model, it actually improves its fit. The fixed effect for press freedom remains significant. And if you add the press freedom as a random effect, it further significantly improves the model fit, and the fixed effect of press freedom remains significant. We also discovered that there's a strong negative correlation between press freedom and mean share counts. So countries with more restrictions in press freedom actually have lower share counts. In a subsequent analysis, we looked at how adding variables for moral norms and pathogen prevalence and their interactions would impact any outcome. And we find that press freedom and pathogen prevalence as main effects do not remain significant any longer, but all categories of the MFT and most pathogen interactions do remain significant. Interestingly, we also find that harm, cheating, subversion, degradation news frames, which are all moral violations, they lead to more shares than their positive counterparts. And interestingly, it's only the positively valenced loyalty variable and not betrayal that actually leads to increased sharing. This specified model actually explains only 3.61% of the variance in share count. So, in conclusion, we would like to reiterate the fact that we acknowledge that these are preliminary findings, but we have demonstrated that variance of share counts can be attributed to the country within which news are published, which indicates that there indeed are underlying country-level factors that shape news sharing. Secondly, we also provided initial evidence that a country's press freedom can be one potential factor that impacts general access to news and exacerbates their online diffusion. Moreover, we highlighted that articles featuring moral violations receive more shares than articles that emphasize the upholding of moral values, and we acknowledge that interactions between a country's historical pathogen prevalence and the sharing of particular moralized news is definitely small, and we plan to examine these relationships in greater depth in the future. Future research will definitely include a greater number of countries, sources, and articles spanning a longer time range. We do plan on implicating other geopolitical variables that we discussed earlier in the presentation, and we also want to expand our indicators of news articles share counts through the retrieval of other metrics from different social media platforms like Twitter that each news article does receive. So overall, I would like to thank my collaborators for helping me out with this research project and for giving me this opportunity to present in front of all of you who are listening and will give me wonderful feedback, I'm sure. So I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to receiving your feedback as well.